Welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast. Here is Munir El-Azouzi from easymedicaldevice.com. And today we will try to help you to understand more what medical device manufacturers should do with data protection, so personal data. So mainly what they can do and cannot do, because there were some news, there was some judgment that happened. So I have with me today Erik Vollebregt, our preferred lawyer. So welcome, Erik, so that he can explain to us, because I think there is a lot of technical discussion here. And it will be better for him to tell us exactly how we can try to understand this situation, because this will impact for sure some manufacturers, and they need to understand and they need to move forward with this judgment. So, Erik, welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast.
Thanks very much, Munir. And I think it's not an understatement to say that this is very technical stuff. I noticed that quite a lot with my clients, of course, and also I'm a member of Medtech Europe's Data Protection Committee, where we had a lengthy discussion about this judgment yesterday. And yeah, it is a really big thing. I would say it has global impact, this judgment. To put it very bluntly, I think the European court showed some serious balls with this judgment. But on the other hand, they also didn't make it a lot easier for people, you could say. Because
So yeah, I think we can really try to make it easier for the audience here to really understand and to know what they should do, because I think they have some actions to do here. Just quickly before we start, maybe there is people that don't know you, so if we can do a quick introduction, because I think there are a lot of people that are listening and are maybe new to the podcast and don't know you specifically. So a quick introduction from yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm Erik. I'm quite a specialized medical devices lawyer. I've been doing work in legal and regulatory work in medical devices for, I don't know, about 20 years by now. So I've seen a lot. As they say in Blade Runner, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. That's what Roy Batty says just before he dies. And I've been very active in many of the European circles around the MDR. I work for a sizable proportion of Medtech Europe and COSIR members. And I've written a lot about the MDR and the IVDR. I write a very popular blog about that, medicaldeviceslegal.com. And with that comes also data protection, which is also because just to make that little bridge, an acronym for the MDR is more data, really.
Yeah, true.
It became known very quickly, and that is also why the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation is such an important thing for medical device manufacturers, because they'll be especially when they're international also, because that is what this Schrems II case is about. They're going to be moving personal data back and forth internationally, and internationally in this context means outside of the European Economic Area, and that is. As soon as you do that, then you're in the scope of the impact of this judgment.
Yeah. So we started. We had. First, I read your blog post. So for people that want to go, there is Erik wrote a blog post on this judgment specifically. So there was a lot of information there, and but. Just maybe let's try to go back and just explain to the people what is this judgment about. So it's called the Schrems II EU court judgment. So what is the impact of this judgment on the transfer of personal data? Because people were, it was possible now, but this judgment changed things. So what did this change?
Yeah, short history about the Schrems series of cases. Mr. Schrems is an Austrian citizen that has decided he is going to pick a protracted fight with Facebook about international transfers of his personal data to the US. which in the first Schrems case meant that he was attacking the legal basis for transferring personal data to the US that applied at the time, which was the safe harbor, right? We had the safe harbor certification for the US,
okay,
which was then invalidated by the European Court of Justice. As a reaction, many companies adopted so-called standard contractual clauses as an alternative legal basis to export personal data from the EU to the US. Then the EU and the US reached political agreement about, let's say, Safe Harbor 2 or Safe Harbor 2.0, the privacy shield. Then Schrems filed another case against the privacy shield because the allegation in the case was that the privacy shield did not meet European requirements for export of personal data because the recourse of European citizens against the US intelligence services having access to their personal data under US intelligence law was insufficient because Privacy Shield has a privacy ombudsman, and basically that did not function at all for the purposes of legal recourse. Because of course, if the privacy ombudsman says, "Oh, NSA, you are being naughty," NSA will never ever stop it. So that's in a nutshell the problem.
So the fact that the US government has some access to some privacy data has, if I can say, blocked everything just because of that. So it's not only US, I suppose, it can be also other governments. So it's not only this one.
Exactly. And that's very important because the Schrems judgment does two things. Because it discusses the legal basis for transfer of personal data, which includes personal data concerning health, to a third country on the basis provided for in the GDPR. Now, the GDPR provides several bases for transfer. For the US, we have Privacy Shield, which was invalidated. So that's let's say, unique US affair. And the GDPR provides for other transfer mechanisms, like, for example, standard contractual clauses, which is basically a standard contract that you can conclude between the exporting party and the importing party to give European citizens third-party rights. There are other means like binding corporate clauses, where you basically have your GDPR quality system. It's literally that, certified by one of the European data protection authorities. And then there's also some exceptions. Now, in Schrems II, the interesting part is that it all centers around the level of protection offered by the third country. And in Schrems II, that became very apparent with the Privacy Shield for the US, but the European Court also says, and that is which is really important for the rest of the world, is that if you are transferring personal data out of the EEA, so the European Economic Area, which is the EU plus some Scandinavian countries, if you are transferring data out of the EEA, then you do that on the basis of standard contractual clauses, you must now ascertain that the local legislation is at an equivalent level as is in the EU.
Okay.
And the big difference between the pre-Schrems II situation and the current situation is that everybody assumed that under the standard contractual clauses, they were, let's say, a standard template contract. If you would just conclude them and you would write in the annex the purpose that you transfer the data for, you would be fine. no due diligence required on the legislation of the member state of the country of import. That has been invalidated now by Schrems II, which is of course a big problem, because how are you going to do due diligence on, let's say, for example, Cambodian data protection law and recourse in Cambodia for European data subjects? And then step two, how are you going to determine if that recourse is appropriate? That is the bind, if you will, that companies are currently into, and which makes international data transfers really tricky at the moment.
So just to clarify, which data we are talking about here? Is it financial data, or is it, when we talk about personal data, what is personal data exactly?
Oh, that's a good question too, because you can really differ in opinion about that. Personal data for EU purposes, so it's all personal data, and personal data is any data that identifies an individual or makes an individual identifiable.
Okay.
And the problem with the concept of identifiable is that it's very broad, because basically it says that if you have a piece of the puzzle that can make an individual identifiable, so even though you do not know yourself who the person is, but you do have a piece of the puzzle, then you already have personal data. So if you can combine it with somebody else's piece of the puzzle, then you both have personal data. And that is a concept that, especially I work a lot for American companies, they never understand. Because they say, yeah, but we don't know who it is. But still, you can localize or you can individualize somebody. So, like, for example, if I know your IP address, Monier, then I can find you on Google Maps. I can know where you live.
Okay.
And even if I don't know that you are Monier, then I still know I can individualize you.
Okay. But here, for example, if we talk about, let's take an example that is more concrete, maybe to medical devices. For example, a clinical investigation. I receive a report of a clinical investigation. It's maybe talking about some patients, how they suffered or not suffered, or the result, etc. Is this personal data or it's not? Because the issue is the fact that some companies are located in the US. They are doing some clinical investigation in Europe. So can they use that? Can they not work on that, etc.?
Well, they can work on it, but then first you need to determine whether there is personal data, of course. And a report doesn't need to be personal data if it's not very specific about individual patients. But for example, the underlying patient registry for the trial, everybody will agree that contains personal data. Then you get to the discussion, yes, but if it's coded, if it has a key that only allows you to see patient identifiers, many people would say then it's not personal data. And that in the EU is not true, because there is somebody that has the key. So that means that you can actually find out exactly who are in the data set. So as soon as there are technical means, I always compare it to, I ask people, like, let's say I have a vault, a safe, and then I take €1 million in $500 notes. I put it in the safe. I close the door. I ask my secretary to put in a code. Is the money in the safe then no longer money?
Okay.
And then everybody says, no, of course it's not money. And I say, yeah, but your argument is that if I don't know the code, but my secretary knows the code, then suddenly the money in the safe is no longer money. I mean, that's worse than a Schrödinger's cat trick, right? I mean, it's like a Schrödinger's denial or something about it. Or let's say, for example, this is me, right? And now I remove a personally identifiable feature. I do like this.
Okay.
So now you still know that you can still individualize me by a lot of my characteristics. For example, my characteristic background, some identifiable features, even though you cannot maybe positively identify me, you can still individualize me.
Okay.
And that is basically the whole thing that personal data is about. But it can lead to some really interesting discussions, like, for example, what processing is as well. Because processing, you cannot export personal data, but exporting doesn't only mean moving data, it can also mean accessing it from a distance. So I've had interesting cases with clients that had capital equipment in hospitals, big scanners, and then they would provide root access at a distance from the US or India to the scanner.
Because everything is now with the cloud or with some servers that are decentralized. If I can say, it's not like when you are recording something, it's in the country. It can be you have a service provider that has a server in the US, so then your data are in the US physically. But it's so
that makes it so difficult, because you need to really understand and map, just like you would map in your quality system, what is covered by the quality system and what interlocks what way, or how you do it with risk assessment. That's also how you need to work with data. You need to really make a very good overview of what happens, how, from where, in order to understand what you are doing, whether you are dealing with extraterritorial aspects of the GDPR. Yeah.
So here we talked mainly about data protection, which is mainly for everybody, but also health data. What is the link here with MDR or IVDR? What is the interaction? Because I remember I looked at the MDR, I find the article 109 and 110. They were talking about some data privacy or some confidentiality. They were not mentioning specifically the GDPR. They are mentioning maybe some other directives. So what is the link here between what we are talking about, the Schrems II and this MDR, IVDR regulation?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one too, because the Article 110 of the GDPR and Article, I think around 100 of the IVDR, they link to data protection legislation, and they link to two pieces of legislation. So there's the European regulation that governs processing of personal data by the European authorities, mainly the European Commission. That hasn't changed. And then there's a reference to the predecessor of the GDPR, the Data Protection Directive 95/46, which was replaced in
2016.
April 2018. That's when it became applicable. It's interesting because just like the MDR, it also had an entry into force date and then a date
transition period, exactly.
Date of application, and the date of application was beginning of May 2018. So that meant that the MDR had already been established when the old data protection directive was still applicable. So that explains it. But in Article 110, you should basically read Regulation 679/216 of the EU, the GDPR. And then there's another interesting link indeed with Article 109. These are the technical stuff in the back of the regulation that nobody wants to read, but really interests the nerds like myself. Because Article 109 provides that imposes a duty of confidentiality on every party that is involved in the application of the directive. The regulation, the MDR. And also the IVDR. And that gives you interesting options when you are working with hospitals, for example, or clinical trial sites, for the purpose of clinical trials or registries or things like that. Because often what we find is that the negotiations with these sites about a data processing agreement or a joint controller agreement, I'll explain these differences in a bit, are become very complicated because the sites will say, yes, but we have medical privilege, and we can't just give you the data, and what is our guarantee that you're going to treat the data confidentially? And Article 109 is a provision that is very much overlooked, I would say, at this stage by the medical devices industry, because it's actually an instrument that says if you process data in the frame of the MDR, then you've got an automatic legal obligation of confidentiality, which is actually way better than you could ever have currently under contract, for example, which should make it a lot easier for health institutions to cooperate with sponsors. And we've seen that in the Netherlands, where we've done quite some work with strategies to connect manufacturers / sponsors and hospitals as joint controllers for the purpose of giving the manufacturer access to a constant stream of post-market clinical follow-up data coming from devices used in the hospital. And that is something that you really need under the MDR to meet your post-market clinical follow-up obligations. If you don't have a plan, for example, about how am I going to get post-market clinical follow-up data from my end users, then the notified body will say this is insufficient. This doesn't meet the mark. So in order to work with the pushback that your end users, that your institutional end users could give you, Article 109 is a very useful article in practice, we found. Yeah.
So if now we go more in the practical way, I am a medical device manufacturer, I receive a lot of data, I am in Europe, so I have no problem. I can use those data, it's not a problem. Now, if I am a US company that has no office in Europe, that has maybe an authorized representative, but no office, how can I work with the post-marketing surveillance, the vigilance, the compliance, all those things that maybe need some personal data to understand what happened in a surgery or what happened here or there? So how they can work with that now?
Well, it depends on currently. Well, first of all, it depends if you do not have any establishment in the EU, then it might still be that the GDPR applies to you territorially because you process data concerning EU data subjects. It might be that you have a branch there and you might be regulated by that virtue. But just like with clinical trials, if you do not have your own legal entity in the EU, you must appoint a legal representative for the GDPR, and that's a function that looks very much like the legal representative that you need to appoint under the MDR Article 62, Section 2, for the purposes of clinical investigation. And actually, you could double that function into a single entity. Let's say you work with a CRO, for example, then the CRO can be your legal representative, both for the MDR and the GDPR, if they have the expertise for that. And these are functions that you have to separately, and that's why it's good to discuss this. You cannot assume that your legal representative for the MDR, for the clinical investigation, will also automatically be your legal representative for the GDPR. So if you're going to appoint the same entity for that, then you need two mandates, basically, or you need to be very clear about, if you do it in a single mandate, that you appoint them for both laws, basically. Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of, so if I'm working there with the CRO, as you mentioned, but if I'm already selling my products to Europe, can I still receive some data if I'm located just to US, or how? Or my authorized representative will be my. I will have to appoint an authorized representative plus a legal person, as you mentioned, for that, so a lawyer or somebody like that.
Well, it depends on the basis that you would be receiving these data currently. For example, it could be that you've got a services agreement in place with a health institution that references the standard contractual clauses. If you're in the US at the moment, then you're in the difficult situation that the controller under the services agreement, which likely will be the hospital, or even more likely, you will be joint controllers. So that means because the hospital processes the data for their purposes, but the sponsor or manufacturer will process the data for their own purposes as well. So for post-market clinical follow-up, that means that the manufacturer could be actually be a joint controller. Well, in that case, then you need to, at the moment, you would need to do two things. For the export of the data where you are a processor, you would need to check whether you would basically need to do due diligence. Does the US provide an equivalent level of protection? Well, that's an answer that the EU court has basically said no under the Schrems II case. So that means that you'll need to do additional things. It might be, for example, that you can say, well, we will do other things, like, for example, if we have a legal representative, we might see if we can do something by giving people legal recourse at the European representative, so legal recourse in the EU, which could be a step.
Okay.
Or what you should do also is you should do your due diligence and see if you've taken any mitigating measures for the export of the data to the US to limit the risk that US intelligence services could actually have access. Because this is still, the whole Schrems case is primarily about intelligence services access. So what you could do as a company is say, well, you could demonstrate that you are outside the scope of that kind of legislation, for example, because I understand that this legislation applies mainly to big tech companies and not so much to, let's say, small and medium-sized medical devices companies. So that would help, for example, to demonstrate that you're outside the scope of that legislation. Unfortunately, there's also a lot we don't know about what the actual requirements are going to be, because still there is an assumption in the Schrems II judgment that more across the board, the US recourse offered is insufficient. So what we are waiting for the moment for is guidance from the European Data Protection Board, who they have issued a press release and Q&A. And the Q&A basically say, well, there is more guidance following, and for the moment, all bets are off. You have to make your own appreciation if you think you're acting legally or not. So that's, of course, that's quite the difficult predicament to put companies in. And what they are also doing, that's a message that I heard about yesterday, is that the GDPR is currently being revised.
Okay.
So they are also intending to revise the standard contractual clauses process. So the idea is that they are going to make that process more clear, is what they say, but of course it's going to be more difficult because you can't use the standard contractual clauses as a template document anymore, but they're going to probably provide for a mechanism or procedure that is more clear about the level of due diligence that you need to do about whether the receiving country provides for an appropriate level of protection.
So what it means actually, it means that we are more in a gray area now, where people are doing things that are not 100% compliant, but in the other side, they don't have any other tool, and the EU is now working on updating that so that they can provide them more tools for that?
That's right. Yeah, basically we're feeling our way along in the anthracite dark area. Yeah, that's the way to characterize it, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So I think this the GDPR, we talked about that a lot of time. So this is something that is not specific to medical devices. It's really to all personal data. But as we can see,
it's really for everybody, you could say.
Okay, can you repeat? Sorry.
I said Facebook ruined it for everybody. Yes.
Yeah, and as medical devices are also having a lot now, a lot of softwares or a lot of application, a lot of things that are processing data, this can also impact heavily, if I can say, the medical device industry. So if you are located in Europe, if you are not processing data, personal data, you are safe. But as soon as you have some application and you are getting some data from people, then you can be impacted by all this.
Yeah, and we're working on several big projects now with bigger international manufacturers that have Internet of Things devices that are in the hospital, connected to each other, connected to the patient, connected to hospital systems, connected to an external cloud service of the client that runs through China or through the US or through Australia or wherever. And then the data is being passed back to the hospital in a more organized way, for example. And this is basically the normal condition that we are going through with more and more connected devices. So that means that as soon as you're doing anything with devices that run software and that involves internet connection, then you're basically with 2 feet deep into the GDPR always.
So data protection, cybersecurity is also maybe in the loop here, so that if you have any breach on your system, you can also have some leakage of data. So everything is interconnected here.
Yeah, and that's also a good point. Actually, if you look in, I've blogged about the new MDCG on guidance on cybersecurity, and one of the talking about GDPR, data protection, and MDR regulatory. If you look into the back, there's an annex with all kinds of examples of cybersecurity risks. What you see is that many of the items that are defined or listed in that annex as cybersecurity risks are in fact data breaches.
Okay.
And that means that even though they could be, let's say, they could be an incident under the MDR, they might also very well be a data breach under the GDPR. So that means that as a manufacturer, you're always having to deal with the interaction between these two pieces of legislation. The GDPR specifically talks about privacy by design, which includes security by design. One of the new items for software in the MDR is GSPR 17, 17.1 to 17.4 in the MDR in Annex 1, and especially I think number 4 really goes into cybersecurity actually. So that's also there. There is a link between the MDR and the GDPR. The GDPR requires you, if you process health data at a large scale, to do a so-called data protection impact assessment, which is basically risk management for data processing. So that's also, again, something that looks very, very much like the risk management you would do with a software running medical device, But these are things that preferably you would do at the same time, because as you can see in this NDCG guidance, 2019-11 it is, I think, you can, let me just look that up for you.
Yeah, I can find it. I will put the link anywhere on the show notes.
That saves us time. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's 11, and or 16, one of the two. But what you see is that basically you need to manage. You need to be mindful of the fact that that when you design a medical device and you reach the level of risk management, you also need to take into account your risk management process for data processing. What I see with manufacturers is that they first do the risk management for the MDR or the MDD still, and then they figure out, oh, there's also this stupid GDPR process that I have to go through. I need to do a DPIA, and that's a stupid form that these nerds from the data protection department make me do. So I just say yes to every question, then that's done. But that's not the way to do this, because basically, you would need to do both of these processes equally diligent, and you would need to be able to show that they really interlock, that data breaches could be incidents under the MDR and vice versa.
So in terms of this specific judgment and law, so it's closed now. Do you think there will be some additional judgments or anything new that will come?
Definitely, yeah, because Mr. Schrems and his foundation have already started local proceedings in many member states with a view to attacking the standard contractual clauses as a means of transfer. Basically saying it's a fundamentally flawed transfer instrument. So that's already happening. The GDPR is under revision, which means that the rules may change. What I also know is that there is quite a movement at EU level in the so-called EU health data space policy to make secondary use of personal data concerning health more industry friendly. Okay. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that even if it becomes more industry friendly, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a free for all, because the Treaty on Functioning of European Union has the right to protection of personal data enshrined in it as a fundamental freedom. And that is something that is often forgotten by manufacturers of devices, because they're like, why are these Europeans so difficult about this stuff? Well, it's because for us, it's fundamental rights. And fundamental rights are not stuff that you can be easy about. So you really have to. That's like, no country is easy about its fundamental rights, except that you sometimes see different accents or emphasis being made. And for Europeans, personal data is really important because we've had quite terrible experiences with abuse of personal data here and there, and even going back to the Second World War. Okay. I mean, if I look at the city that I live in, they did racial profiling at that time, the municipality. So they just had these big drawers of cards that would say, this person is a Jew and this person is gay. And the Germans could seize that whole archive, and they could just go arrest all the Jews and deport them to be killed because of racial profiling. And that is why Europeans take this stuff incredibly seriously.
So I think this. I hope this clarifies all the process that is happening, or all the situation that's happening here for data protection in Europe. I hope some people from the US will hear that and will understand exactly why this can happen, or why they can have some difficulty to transfer some information from Europe to the US. So yeah, in terms of your activity, I know that in September there is a lot of events that are coming because there is a lot of speaking things. So is there anything that we can already advertise for people to say that you are working on something new now?
Well, in September, I'm going to be speaking at quite a lot of conferences, the RAPS convergence on economic operators, the Euro convergence on economic operators as well. I'm going to be on a panel about the MDR for AlphaMed at the Medtech.
Okay.
In September, I'll also be on doing a seminar for AlphaMed DX on the IVDR.
All this is virtual or it's face-to-face conferences?
No, it's all virtual. I'm speaking, I'm doing a Q1 webinar on self-testing IVDs under the IVDR, another one on IVDR, and of course, I'm finalizing my big book on the MDR and the IVDR, the big annotated version, which is, I need to come to a point where I can say, okay, people, this is good enough as to be sold as a 0.8 version. So I'm looking for feedback. Maybe that would be nice to have from your listeners. I'm currently thinking about just getting it out there as a 0.8 version and then giving people the possibility to get a reduction on the second edition. Maybe that's something that would work for people or would be interesting. I'm interested in getting feedback about that.
So I will maybe mention that on the show notes, and people, if you want to contact directly Erik Vollebregt for that, that can be helpful. Because I know that you are working on this book, and I hope we can talk about that when it will be released, so that we can maybe point out some elements that will be interesting for the audience here. Okay, so really thank you, Erik. Was really interesting. I hope we'll have maybe some a part 2 of this episode that is more talking about maybe some new solutions or things that are available for manufacturers, because I think as you've said, it will not stop here. But be ready.
Very theoretical, I admit. So that's frustrating for people. I understand as well. Yeah.
So be ready with your data protection, be ready with all this. If you hear about this situation, so you know now why it's happening. So be careful with the data that you are transferring. And I hope, as I've said, that we'll have another episode with Erik to have more solutions if you are in this situation. Okay, Erik, so really thank you for your support. Thank you for all the information, and I wish you a nice day.
Very welcome. Have a nice day.